Good afternoon, everyone. I'm in King County. This is King County on Martin Luther King Celebration Day. 30 years, MLK, King County. How lucky am I? I'm a very lucky man today. Well, yes, I am. It's my great honor to be here with you. I want to first say thanks to Heather Dwyer, to Paula Harris-Smith, to Jim Kelly, and all the folks who helped make my presence here happen today. Heather Dwyer with For Culture. I think she was the first person who heard me speak in Minneapolis about innocence, and at the time I was talking about innocent giving. I will give you a full measure of that in this talk in a very brief period of time. But it's my first time in this great city. And from where I live, I've always looked to Seattle as one of the great progressive cities in this country. So I'm super happy to have this opportunity to visit with you. I live in Minneapolis, where by now we've already stopped talking about football. So in some ways I get to stick my toe in the waters of success that you get to enjoy. I come to you from the frigid Midwest, and I'm not joking about that. I mean, I know it's cold here, and I grew up in Philadelphia, so I was used to winter, but man, Minnesota brings a whole new definition to that. I mean, I'm going back home to minus 18 degrees. Yeah, well, whatever. That's what I meant. Like, I'm lucky right now. Anyway, being an author, a novelist, I've been asked to do my share of Martin Luther King celebrations over the years. I have, especially when my novel, Amistad, was in greater demand. But as I prepared for my remarks this year, I was struck by a kind of ironic power I felt surrounded this year's MLK events. I mean, we are less than 2 weeks away, as you've heard. And by the way, I mean, your leadership here is that concept of the progressive city, county that King County is, it's earned because your leadership are truly progressive political leaders. That is not a common reality across this country. So we are, as you heard, we are less than 2 weeks away from a presidential inauguration that has challenged many of us to step back and really struggle with where this country is today. And think about the world of Martin Luther King. His world was at least as problematic as ours is today. And guess what? No one in my lifetime has exuded more positive, oppositional energy than Martin Luther King. And much has been written and said about that in this way, about how he stood up to that energy, that negative energy. And of course, he was a man of God. But he also had a great faith in this country and its people. I think Barack Obama exudes the same kind of energy. Martin Luther King believed in America. He believed in its promise. It takes that kind of faith and love to look down the barrel of injustice and demand that people pull themselves out of the delusion of racial discrimination and hatred. I mean, he really believed in love at its most fundamental level. And he believed in this country, sometimes in spite of its leadership. And perhaps it's my age now or my own delusion, but I agree with him and his position more now than I ever did. It's times like this that further elevate the vision and power of Martin Luther King's dreams. But how do we effectively celebrate, honor him this year? How can any of the planned tributes and celebrations for Martin Luther King do justice to that man? Our tribute, maybe, must manifest itself in action. We have to change our trajectory. We have to change the direction we're going. I think that's how we have to celebrate him. The truth is that the capacity and the reward for any and all attempts to honor Martin Luther King is already within us. This is why we come together to think again about his ideas. And that is why I wanted to be here today with you. Martin Luther King told us America owes a debt of justice. It still does. But the question before us now is, from where does justice emanate? Just the other night, in his farewell address, President Obama said, "We're not where we need to be. All of us have more work to do." After all, if every economic issue is framed as a struggle between a hardworking white middle class and undeserving minorities, then workers of all shades will be left fighting for scraps, while the wealthy withdraw further into their private enclaves. If we decline to invest in the children of immigrants just because they don't look like us, we diminish the prospects of our own children, because those brown children will represent a larger share of America's workforce. But laws alone won't be enough. Hearts must change. If our democracy is to work in this increasingly diverse nation, each one of us must try to heed the advice of one of the great characters in American fiction. I'm still quoting Barack Obama when he quotes Atticus Finch saying, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." How do we learn how to create justice in a culture where it is still a debt? The kind of debt that Martin Luther King was talking about. Laws have been passed, and still justice remains a longing. Do we have to provide details? Do we have to talk about the reality of abuses of power? Do we have to talk about disparities in housing, in income, in health care, or perhaps worst of all, disparities that exist in education? I think everyone, all of us, has a role to play in this. In each of our lives, there are moments when we can actually create a moment when justice springs into being. We can literally manifest it right there in front of us. We can do this. For example, if each one of us pledged today that from this moment forward, in the spaces we control, in our classrooms, in our offices, in our homes, everywhere we dominate, stereotypes should have no place. So let me step back and begin my talk. I'm a storyteller, so no public engagement is valid without a story. One day this past spring, I walked out of my house on my way to do errands when I was immediately hit by an overwhelming sense of sadness. It was such a bright, wondrous day, and the heavy, sweet smell of blooming lilacs swirled around me. It should have made me happy, joyous, but instead it was the certain way the sunlight careened off the buildings and sidewalks, or the smell of spring, or a combination of both, that swept me into the past. And no matter how bucolic or sun-swept my memories of the past may be, they almost always leave me sad. And so this story ends in a sadness of sorts, a caution, so to speak. I grew up in North Philadelphia, not far from the Philadelphia Zoo, and enmeshed in a neighborhood of intensity. It was a neighborhood of working-class black folks who had grabbed onto the promise of the American dream and were barely holding on. But on my street, the sun did shine. And Saturdays were full of purposeful activities like cleaning the house and turning the garden hose on cement sidewalks in front of the houses. As a child, I used to love pickles. Dill pickles, Jewish pickles, sour pickles, sweet and sour, hot or sweet, it didn't matter. Even thinking about this now brings a rush of saliva to my mouth. I attended an elementary school a block and a half from my house, so I always run home for lunchtime, eat the food my mother prepared, usually some sort of sandwich and a bowl of soup, and then I'd do or say whatever I had to get, in order to get out of the house. And with that remaining 15 or 20 minutes that I had left before the afternoon bell rang, I would set out for Little John's. Now, Little John's was one of those idiosyncratic stores you can always find in the inner city, a store that might carry an astonishing variety of goods from penny candy to staples, from bread to balloons, but does so in a space barely big enough for 10 people to stand in without touching. And Little John's was even more unusual in that it was a corner store that was actually located in the middle of the block. It was on Cybert Street, a couple of blocks away from in the opposite direction of my school. So I remember that as you approach the store, you'd be assaulted by this makeshift wooden enclosed stairway that just jutted straight out in the middle of the block. It would almost stop you from just walking by. forcing a kid like me, I'm going in. So you have to understand that in many of Philadelphia's inner cities, like in many communities, so many of the houses are exactly the same. Conjoined like a series of train cars being pulled toward the Delaware River or somewhere off in the distance, depending almost entirely on the creative and financial resources of the residents to distinguish one house from the other. It's a good thing that there are addresses. That's all I'm really saying here. So Little John's was a small wonder. And inside Little John's, there was always a barrel full of pungent brine. Pungent brine. And swimming in that brine were the largest dang dill pickles you've ever seen. Bigger than any pickles I've seen since. And it wasn't just that they were big, they were fully pickled. So thoroughly saturated that the first bite might close your mouth all together in a tight vinegared clinch. So what I'm saying is I'd rush from my mother's wholesome Campbell's soup lunch, for which I now realize I owe such an amazing debt, head straight for Little John's. There, for a mere quarter, I would dive into that barrel and spear my catch. And from there, I was destined back to school, obviously unconcerned with the damage that pickle might do to my natural cologne. Now, I remember walking out of Little John's with this big pickle and literally skipping up the street. Skipping, I tell you. And in this memory, the sun fanned the most brilliant light all about, and the bricks were vivid red, and the asphalt the deepest black, and I was just so happy. This is proof. I was innocent then. Only someone who is without guilt can skip. The slightest weight of guilt will take the skip right out of your gate. But on this day, there were no suspicious eyes on me, no sense of outsiderness, of being the son of a demon, nor a criminal. I was just the happiest little colored boy, sucking on my dill pickle and tra-la-lying home. But I will refrain, and you have to know, there is an art to eating a pickle. But I will refrain from the details of this joy, for in a world colored by a brilliant but only half-right pioneer psychotherapist, who shall not be named here, my description would almost certainly be misinterpreted. It must then suffice to say that I know that once I was innocent. And by innocent, I mean that I knew the world was open to me, that I was without guilt, that no one suspected me of any crime. How special this was for an African-American boy to be able to skip effortlessly down the street. But more to the point, imagine how rare that is today. Black boys are suspected of criminal intent so early in their lives these days they hardly ever get a full measure of innocence, which, by the way, I believe is essential to being a healthy adult. We must know what it means to feel innocent. It's one of the most significant benchmarks in a person's life. And I know that my mother understood this and did the only thing a parent could do. She tried in so many ways to preserve my innocence as long as she could. No one else told me that no matter how smart you are, how much you believe you can do anything you put your mind to, all that stuff, the truth is the energy you need to be whole in this culture will be taken from you as a rite of passage. Those are your dues as a person of color, as a black person in America. You must give up your innocence, be seen as guilty, eventually feel guilty before you even get a chance to demonstrate your potential. Justice for me begins here. When the world we live in marks us because of skin color or language differences, it begins a story about us that we have to fight to get control of. My story is for me to tell. Your story is for you to tell. And we all have a story. And it's unjust that some of us inherit the wound of bad stereotypes that I promise you actually are the cause of so much injustice. Throwing this off, shaking off that load, to paraphrase Erykah Badu, of negative images and stereotypes is the first challenge people of color have in this culture. And there is very little training on how to do it. So this is my work, because as I've said, we have to identify the place where injustice, rather than justice, is created and strengthened, and it is there we must begin to rebuild our cultural fabric. Yes, I'm telling you that we have to create a new way of seeing each other, a new way of talking to each other. Even though less than a month from now we will inaugurate a president that has divided our country, even though the toxic cloud of racial tension threatens to thicken around us, even in this world, I'm saying we must fight for our own individual innocence, the right to tell our story, the right to be who we naturally are, devoid of the cloak of negative images and stereotypes that attempt to define us. So as I said, this is my work. I'm out to build, in my work in the education arena, I'm out to build an army of teachers who sign on to the challenge of freeing our children from the negative stereotypes they live in bondage to. And just to put a point on that, when our children begin to embrace their innocence, that is, they stop relying on stereotypes to tell them how to feel, how to react, they suddenly become better students, more engaged, more openly curious. This is where the new fight for justice must begin, I believe, with our children. We have to convince them there is a bountiful future, that they have value, that they can see, that we can see them for who they really are, that they can trust the people who are charged with leading them through life, with teaching them what they need to know. My work, helping teachers build stronger, more authentic relationships with students. The students they must teach, is my attempt to reset the bar of justice. See this Hispanic child. See this black child. See this Native child, this Asian American child, as a human being who deserves to be seen outside of the filter of the negatives popularly associated with other people who have the same skin color. See that child. Children of color, particularly African American children, are being held in a virtual bondage to the negative stereotypes about them that have developed over time. These stereotypes define our children. Oh, I could say, tell me what America tells you about African American children. Huh? We don't want to do this, but I've done this exercise over and over again. Threatening, violent, criminal, poor, academically disengaged. I could go on. And these guilts are internalized by our children before they even enter the school door, because they know they think that's what the culture is saying about them. The stereotypes actually become a script that influences their behavior and inhibits their ability to be engaged learners. It's the reason for the achievement gap, in my opinion, and other disparities in the education system. No education reform effort, to my knowledge, has even had the slightest impact on the interior development of our children. My creation, The Innocent Classroom, is an attempt to free children from their bondage to stereotypes by transforming educators into liberators. The new definition of innocence that we use should be understood as the reduction, minimization, or elimination of the guilt that develops from negative stereotypes. And to do this, educators must commit to developing authentic, intentional relationships with each student in their classroom, creating a classroom where children are free of negative expectations. The Innocent Classroom does something no other response to disparity does. It offers a process for creating relationships. Without them, no effort, no reform strategy can hope to be successful. Perhaps we've come to the end of an age, maybe. Public education, in the sense that schools take in hundreds of students, crowd them into rooms that are sorted by age, and expect all of them to learn what is being taught. Maybe that process is coming to an end. In particular, our system's inability to reach children of color may in fact be its last rasping breath. When I think of children of color, in my head, in my dreams, when their images are disconnected from reality, they appear as I see or saw myself as a child. Curious, energetic, smart, brilliant even, innocent, yes, innocent. Young, gifted, and innocent. I mean, if you can imagine America as a concept, or even as a person, one big imposing figure that whispers to us, its whispers are not truths, but pieces of the truth, which one might say are lies. The whispers tell us that our children are, what I said, disruptive, violent, angry, loud, lazy. Again, I've been in scores of districts, asked hundreds of teachers, tell me what America tells you about the children you teach. And those are the words, those words we heard. I could repeat them, there could be more, are the words that our educators say, but it's not just educators. This is common. This is what America is doing to our kids. You can fill out that list. No one is immune to these whispers. Not the children, their parents, the media, which is the ultimate conduit for the whispers themselves, or even those chosen to be their educators. Everyone hears these whispers. And unfortunately, our children are susceptible to the power of stereotypes, which is what is being whispered. The whispers carry negative images, narratives, descriptions. Think about the music, the movies. Think about the games they play. Just think about all of the whispers that are happening around our kids all the time with nobody there to help them sort, many times. Nobody there to help them sort through. Strong family, no problem. Church, no problem. There are ways in which our children can be saved, but otherwise they are left to fend for themselves. And those whispers are powerful. They are so powerful. They are so powerful that they work their way into their brains in such a way that it begins to dictate behavior. It becomes a script. And I believe those words are internalized as guilt in the bodies of our children and steals lingering innocence right out of their lives, maybe forever. What good is being innocent in a world of guilt, especially in a world where innocence is seen as weakness? They're trapped. We all are trapped in a world that unconsciously seeks to normalize an unjust reality. But we can break free. We have to. We have to start with our children and the education they receive. Stereotypes drape us in a heavy cloak of guilt, and it must be thrown off. If I feel like a gang member to you or to me simply because I'm a young black male, I've already taken on the weight of being a gang member. I have a choice to make. I'm trapped in a reality in which I may commit myself to convincing you that I'm not what you think I am, which is pretty bad already, or I could choose to surrender to this expectation. But whatever I choose, I would probably not change the way you feel about me until you know me. The image of me is stronger. The image of me is stronger than my reality. So when a teacher is confronted with a child who is acting out of the demands of a stereotype, they may not recognize that child's behavior as inauthentic, but as a true expression. I believe most of what the world sees from our children, marginalized children, children of color, and especially black children, particularly black boys, is not an authentic representation of who they really are. Maybe this is the dawn of a new age in public education, the age of the child, the individual single child, the innocent child. Perhaps it's time to revisit Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning when we think of the realities our children of color must survive. Writing about his experience in the German concentration camps, he called it a provisional existence of unknown limit. And as I passed back over his thoughts about being a prisoner, I couldn't help thinking about the children who file into school every day. Frankl wrote, "A man who could not see the end of his provisional existence was not able to aim at an ultimate goal in life. He ceased living for the future in contrast to the man in normal life." My idea of the innocent classroom is based on the notion that children will react differently when they are aware of their innocence, where it is acknowledged, nurtured, and finally assumed. The concept of the innocent classroom puts forth the idea that classrooms in a school where that sense of innocence predominates the environment will be transformed into a propulsive energy that has the potential to stimulate the desire to learn, because learning immediately has a purpose, that is to serve that child's innocence and goodness. And I have to tell you that when teachers embrace this idea, our children look up at them as if they are seeing those teachers for the first time. The veil is lifted, and our children emerge as themselves, as who they really are, curious, energetic, and capable scholars. So the message I wanted to give to you today on this weekend of on this day as a part of a weekend celebration, when people all over the world are paying tribute to the man and his achievements, is that the future of this country, of our lives, lies not in history, but in the present. How will we prepare ourselves to be a force for change in this country that is our home? And will we learn how to make our home a home in which people, other people who are different from us, also feel at home? Yes, there is a debt of justice that we must bring into being. And yes, the promise of America is unfulfilled. But we are here. And despite the political environment, despite the negative energy that rises around us, we are strong enough to fulfill the mandate that Martin Luther King gave us. We can learn how to create everywhere around us, everywhere we have power to. We can create justice out of the wreckage of racism, bias, and hatred. We can because that is who we are. Thank you so much for listening to me.